Well, welcome back to It's Still Good on Tuesday. We are glad that you are along today, and we hope that your day is going well, and we appreciate you joining us for our podcast as we begin another conversation where we're talking about the book of Titus, the little letter of Titus. If you would like to follow along in your Bible, we're in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 today. So again, we're glad you're along, and we're going to enjoy this time of talking together about God's Word. All right, guys, so Titus chapter 3, talking about culture. How do we, as a church, and not just as a church individually, singularly, but as the church, how should the church interact with the couple, with the culture? I'm reading a book right now by Rod Dreher called Live No More Lies. Or Live Not by Lies, I'm sorry. And that book is a warning about how churches can be seduced into culture, and he works really through the Soviet churches, and how the Soviet Union, communism basically came in and began to encroach and moved into totalitarianism, all this kind of thing. So it's an interesting read. It's oddly, scarily kind of familiar. I'm seeing some of those themes working out some in our nation. So we're always in this tense relationship with culture. Do we bless what the culture's doing? Do we try to get along? Do we stand away from it and throw rocks at it? And all of that has to do that our thinking about that has to do with how we relate to people. Again, I think I used the term yesterday. Do we see people as enemy combatants, or do we see people as created beings that God loved and made in His image? How do we relate to people? So you've got some extremes. We'll talk about that. But this is what Titus was told by Paul. Titus chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Paul said, remind the church, remind the people to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Now, this is part one of 3 parts of how do we as people, how do we engage, how do we relate to a changing culture? And our culture has changed radically. What do you think is the main thing that's brought change in our culture?
Ooh, that's hard to pin down because, I mean, we've got a vernacular that we didn't even have 10 years ago.
Okay,
there's
so
words
communication, language is
there's words that we're even talking about that no one considered because, moving from more or less modernity, there was a right, there was a wrong, there was reality, there was only empirical evidence, and now it's moved to more like, how do you feel about reality? And so, it's really complicated to have a conversation with somebody about the culture when they have this perceived reality that's not really reality, and then there's the other perception. And so now it's all about whatever your reality is yours, and whatever my reality is mine. And so
we can't even have the conversation.
Yeah,
really.
There's no foundation to have conversation across anymore.
Yeah,
and that's been a challenge for me.
Yeah. What do you see, Dan?
Well, especially I think in the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, the biggest change has just been the how people have wanted to just divide everybody. That depending on different topics and different things, there's almost no middle ground. There's no place for healthy conversations. It's like you're either with me or you're against me. You're either on this side or you either love or you hate. There's just this great divide in our culture and especially in our country, and so that I think obviously we talk a lot, especially with our teenagers and our students and this next generation about truth and what is truth. And I agree with Jason that if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, that's probably been the biggest change. But in the last 3 to 5, just how divisive. You can't even have a healthy conversation on either side of any issue, without it being a personal attack.
Yeah, people are on a hair trigger with anger and just ready to be offended. They're just sitting in a posture of just waiting to hear something that offends. And I don't know how much of that again loops back into internet issues. How much of that it loops into because if you don't have anything to say, get on the internet and say something angry, and people will like it. You don't have to have a message to communicate. Just be angry. The fact that you are.
It doesn't even have to be accurate. You can just make up something, and people are going to jump on that bandwagon.
And the problem again with the internet is that anybody can say anything. Anybody can be a celebrity for a moment on the internet. You can put a blog up. You can put a podcast up, or you can do any number of things. I mean, anybody can do it.
Sure.
Write a book, and put it on the internet, or record a song. So there's no filter. Everything goes onto the internet now. And again, but I think what people have learned is if you're angry, if there's something volatile and something that incites people emotionally, to feel a certain way about something, even anger, then it's let's do that. Let's pull that up. And so we're seeing a lot of that, and that feeds into the divisiveness, I think, of our country. And even this, what Paul's saying here, is controversial to our day, but it's also, we can't imagine, I don't think, how controversial these words were in the day that Titus brought them, when he spoke them. Because this is this was a hot button. How do we relate to a government that we don't agree with? How do we relate to a government that is, more than that is determined to stamp us out?
Press.
And how do we, as it says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, how do we pray for kings and leaders and those in authority? How do we do that? When the king is Caesar, when the king is a man who, maybe burnt a relative of yours alive because of their faith. So what do you, how do you do that? How do you work that through? The reality was, again, I think I said this yesterday too, or in the sermon, I know that Roman citizens were required by law to offer incense, and even as a passport to get into a city, people were required. Doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not, you were required to do this. The annual visit to the altar was required of citizens. You had to show that you had done that, and that's just like paying your taxes every year. I'm going to give my loyalty to Caesar here. Slaves were not mandated to do that because they weren't citizens, because they weren't people. So they didn't have to do that because they were not citizens. This was not part of their citizenship requirement. So at least that's what I read somewhere. I didn't know exactly where I picked that up, but still, for the most part, if you were a property owner, if you were if you were a professional person or you were a craftsman in Rome, you would have to do that.
Well, and that was an issue, particularly in the early church under Domitian. They were required to do that, and then Domitian dies, right? And so then the intensity of the persecution on the Christians lifts, and so then you have this issue of the people who did profess Christ, the martyrs, the professors, but then the other people who recanted in order to save their life. And the church almost wouldn't even let people back in because it's like, no, you cowed down, you gave into that government. And they're just in this infighting now in the church of like, who's your biggest God? Is it Caesar or is it Jesus? And I feel like that's the tension that somewhat we're in with the church, because you've got the cultural isms, and we need to like in somewhat engage that culture. But at what point is it too far to where the other Christians are like, oh, you're a recanter, you've bowed down to the culture? And then now even within the church there's this argument of, what is too far, what's uncomfortable, what's acceptable before Christ. And it's a really hard line to walk.
So again, but my point I was trying to make with this yesterday or the other day was this is a cultural battle what they were. This was how they were deciding. How do we relate to the culture? How do we, and they could have they could have become insurrectionists. They could have become arsonists. They could have become, and there were zealots in their number.
Right.
Jesus had a couple with his disciples, that were let's draw swords. Let's go, let's go after them. And there were people who were ready to take up arms and go, let's do this, And so there's again, all of that is a reaction to culture. All of that, you cannot not react. You're in a culture.
Yeah.
Okay, you're in a culture. Dave and I went to the opening of a new coffee shop in Maynard back in the summer. We actually had started a relationship with the young man that owns the shop and started talking to him and made really good coffee, and we just got in some really great conversations. He knew some of the shops we'd gone to, and we just we're talking about that, and then he found out I was a pastor, but he invited us to his grand opening. He wanted he specifically invited, said, would you guys come to the grand opening? Sure. So we left, we went, and he it was a cultural experience for me. I wound up in a subculture that I didn't know existed in Maynard. First of all, it probably needs to be said. First of all, I was no doubt the grandfather there. I was the oldest person there. There was no question. Nobody was even in the same decade as me, maybe the same generation. I'm not even sure, but it was there were a lot of younger people and me. Dave and I were two of a handful of normal looking people in terms of our hair is not dyed, or we are not covered with tattoos or with, and you could pretty much identify our gender, and I realized then this is a culture in Mandarin. I didn't know it was here. I think we talked about this a little bit, staff. I don't know of a church. You take the hippest, most on the edge church out there. I don't know of a church that will be able to reach that culture. Don't know of one. How would you do that? And so there was all of that was going. I'm just thinking in my head. I'm thinking this is a cultural issue. This is a cultural battle that we don't know how to fight. We don't even know what the war is in that situation.
Yeah.
But we have to figure out how do we relate even to that kind of culture that's so different from us. And if they came in to the church, we would probably have to coach folks a little bit to say, hey, listen, there's some folks coming in, and they're going to have green and purple and blue hair, and probably on the same person, and you just welcome them and let them come on in, and it's okay.
Yeah.
But it's again, this is what's happened. The culture is changing, and it's challenging us, I think, in terms of how we typically have done outreach, how we do evangelism. And how do you relate to and love that part of the culture, So anyway, but
And so I guess that's where I would have a slightly different, maybe perspective to add to it is, the church is for Christian people. We are the ecclesia, it's the people, right? So to invite lost people to the church, you can do it, but they're gonna feel out of place because they're not part of the assembly.
Well, exactly, and that's what
so,
I thought. As I was standing there at that coffee shop with 150, 200 kids there, I never felt so out of place. I thought, I don't belong here. I don't fit here.
You're not part of that subgroup.
Right, that's not my culture.
Well, they would feel the same thing. They're not part of our subgroup. And part of the gospel is repent and turn. And I'm not saying that's like purple and green hair is part of that list, but there are some things that, in order to be part of that the subgroup, which is the church, there's some things you have to leave behind. And so, in some ways, saying, "Hey, you come just as you are to our church," they're going to be like, "Do I fit in?" No, you won't. You won't fit in because you're not part of us. But that doesn't mean you're not welcome. And communicating that is a challenge, especially when some of them have chosen specifically to be like diametrically opposed to what we say. So some of that is hard. But I look at where Jesus went. Jesus went to places that were diametrically opposed to the religious establishment, and that's actually what got him in trouble with the religious establishment. And so, being that friend of sinners, I think, is kind of the hardest one of the hardest things for many Christians to learn to do.
And letting sin be defined not as somebody being different than us.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to strip away culture and just go. So where are these human beings? They look different. They look odd to me. But when you strip the cultural markings away, what do we have here? That's the hard thing. We have to figure out how to relate to people beyond just that cultural veneer that we're all going to pick up. Somebody, you guys have we're all in a subculture.
Right.
We're in a subculture as a church.
Right.
We have our own, as some people say, Christian ghetto. We've got our own. We're locked into these walls of how we think about the world and how we think about life, and that's okay. I mean, you're going to do that. That's human nature, but it works against the gospel. It works against evangelism. It works against being able to get beyond that.
So is a lot of this passage, just reminding the believers that this culture is watching how you react and what you say and what you say to each other.
Yeah, and that's and it's challenging because it is. These are things their go-to would be oppose rulers and authority, or give them a hard time, whether that's a governor or a soldier, or a soldier that's making you carry his pack because that was Roman law of that time. Or that was a boss that didn't understand you, or a slave and master relationship where the master is not kind. Those kind of things, you would push back against that kind of authority. But Paul's saying no. He's not. It's easy to be submissive. If you really like the president, you really like your governor, you really like those kind of leaders. Man, I'll wear your T-shirt. I'm for you. But when you don't like them, that's when you need this command.
Yeah.
You need to be submissive to rulers and authorities, even understanding that some of them are not going to be on your side and they're not going to be on the same page with them. But you do that anyway because, again, this is how the culture will look at you.
I think a lot of Christians have heard these verses before and have read them in a teaching kind of way of, this is how a Christian is to act. But do they really understand the reason why? Like, why do I need to be submissive to a government or authority that I don't agree with?
Tell us why.
Well, I think that's the conversation we're saying, is that it affects our witness when we are doing that. And I think it's a really hard thing for Christians to understand. Where is the line that I hold, like you mentioned in the beginning, that I'm not for some of these things that the government is for, or that other people are saying, but that I'm still required by God, by Christ, to submit to the government, submit to authorities. And so, because of why? Like, what's the purpose? And you got to think about it from a heavenly perspective, right? We don't obey all of the government's mandates just so that we are an A+ citizen. It is for the purpose of the gospel, because we are just here for a short time, and then we will be in our eternal home. And so we don't need to get straight A's in our citizenship report card to get into heaven, it's merely for the opportunity to witness. And so we have to be careful that the things that we're saying on social media, we're saying to our neighbors, are not in some ways putting up a barrier to us presenting the reason why we are doing these things or saying these things, giving us a barrier to keep us from having the opportunity to witness. And so I think a lot of decisions that we need to make, and we probably won't get into it today, all the different topics that we could in this area, but the decisions that we make, a lot of Christians make based on their preference, based on what they think is right or wrong, or what they personally want to do or not do. But do you stop and think about, are you putting your preference above the opportunity to witness to someone who's lost, that is a coworker or a neighbor or someone who just follows you on social media and sees your reaction and your response to some hot button topic, and it just closes them off to listening to you any in the future? And so I think that's a lot of what is being said here in these two verses, is like, listen, remind them, that the way you respond to the government, the way that you respond when it comes to gossip and rumor and other things like that, is a testimony to your faith, and you need to be careful, what you say.
Well, and you mentioned citizenship yesterday, and I thought that was very timely for this text, because as Christians, we do have a preeminent citizenship, and that's the kingdom of heaven. King Jesus is our sovereign.
Yeah.
But we're in a different position as Americans, where we actually like our country. Many of them reminisce about the way even the country used to be, versus some of our other brothers and sisters around the world. They don't like their country. They don't like their government, and they feel the boot of that persecuting government over top of them. And so for them to feel more like pilgrims and sojourners in their home native country, it's easier for them than for a lot of Christians. They've convoluted, we'll say, political activism or cultural engagement or something like that with the kingdom of God. And it's like, no, the kingdom of God, separates you, and then you're supposed to then return back to the culture to engage it, but not become part of it, not to integrate with it. And I don't know, I always am struggling with that one with students, because they so deeply want to be accepted by their peers in school, and so they're willing to do all sorts of outlandishly weird stuff just so they can have acceptance by their peers. Meanwhile, we're asking the question and waving the flag like, okay, but all those things that you're doing so that you can be accepted, are they Christian? Is that something that Jesus, your sovereign, would want you to do? And there's this major tension that I am constantly running into for students.
I had a conversation one time when I was in Cuba with a gentleman at an outdoor cafe. We were drinking coffee. And he told me he had a Cuban flag on his shirt. And he said, Pastor, I love my country.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I love what it was before Castro came. He said, I love being Cuban. I love my identity as a Cuban person. I'm not happy with where things are right now, but I love my country. So, and that kind of, I had kind of gone in thinking, oh, everybody here, it's almost like a prison island, and they're all captive, and they really don't want to be there. They love Cuba. They love what the Cuban,
their
nation
culture and home
and their culture is about. But they, again, they lost that under the regime that's there now. But it's just, it was a real interesting change of perspective for me. So I thought, man, that's, I never would have thought about that.
So we're not saying like that, because again, I do think some Christian believers, they struggle with wanting to be a part of helping this country get back to what it was, or to get in a right place, and so where is the balance between social activism but still doing it in a way that is respectful and submissive, so that it doesn't affect our witness to a lost and dying world? That's a hard...
Yeah, and it is a hard line, because, again, I think my fear is more, I see more people, again, struggling with, where is my truest allegiance, allegiance? We, as Paul said, I am a citizen. Paul was a proud Roman citizen. Paul was born into Roman citizenship, and he was proud of being a Roman. This was not something, again, if you became a citizen of Rome, you either had to be born into it or you had to buy it. And a lot of the soldiers that fought for Rome weren't citizens of Rome. They couldn't afford it.
Right.
Or they were not Roman born, so they had to come up with whatever money they had to decide, however much it cost to buy your citizenship. But, this was something they worked for, to be able to say, I'm now a citizen of Rome. Well, when you get there, that was a high value thing. You just went, oh, I'm a Roman.
Right.
But for Paul to be able to go from being, a Jewish person who was also a Roman person, who was now also a citizen of heaven, he had three loyalties he had to kind of work through here, and it would be easy to fall back into any, one of those lower loyalties, and for the sake of, well, this is where my true patriotic duty is to defend Rome, or is to make sure Judaism is prospering, versus following Jesus, and this is the questions that we have to answer now, because we're going to find ourselves in a time when we're going to have to make a decision of, are we going to follow Jesus, or are we going to follow the flag of any country, whatever the country, and it may not be possible to do both. And it certainly today is already not possible to do both in some nations. You cannot follow the flag of that nation and honor the flag of that nation and be a faithful Christian person, you know. And it's you know, I think, you know, it's any country, any government, any earthly government is susceptible to that possibility that we could end up being a country that, you know,
and we've seen this a lot, you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, you know, and I think any believer, what they need to do, you know, is they need to, it's a hard line to figure out, but it's worth, you know, trying to figure it out, you know, and in areas that it's not against your causes.
And we have to figure it out before we're in crisis over it.
Correct.
We have to decide this is the way we're going to walk before the time comes that we have to stand and make a choice at a crossroads.
Yeah, I tell students all the time, like you've got to do the work ahead of time to know what decisions you need to make in those moments, because sometimes in those moments you don't have time or the ability to
can't work it out.
So work it out ahead of time, you know.
Yeah.
So what are those non-negotiables? What are the things that, and if it's not, you know, you mentioned the traffic light illustration yesterday, you know, sit at a traffic light for an extra minute or two, you know, do whatever is not against your conscience, but to show the fellow citizens of your country that you are submissive to the authority, understanding that ultimately God has allowed that government to be in place.
And I think, and this is good, I think the other piece of this too is we don't really fully understand how a pagan world saw Christianity when it first began.
Yeah.
And let me just put you guys, let's just say you are Bill and Barry Pagan, okay? So you're living in the neighborhood, and moving into your neighborhood is this new family. And here's the reputation, here's the rumor you've heard. Do you know those new people? Did you know they drink blood?
Mm-hmm.
Did you know they eat people?
Yep.
And, you know, they're called Christos, something, but they worship this God that was supposed to have died and is living again, and they gather together and they sing strange music and then they drink blood.
Oh yeah, it definitely sounds very cultish.
You want them in your neighborhood? You know?
I mean,
so this was what the early Christians were having to overcome.
Oh yeah.
And this is why Paul was saying, listen, be careful. Mm-hmm. Don't let people don't walk into their misconceptions of you. Mm-hmm. You know, don't walk into their misconceptions that you are you know, you're a person who is going to be rebellious against the government, or you know, people that are going to cause all kinds of, you know, again, you know, it's, and then there's still, I've got, you know, I heard people tell me before already, in their neighborhoods, they have people, or they know of people who have tried to have a prayer meeting or even a church meeting in their home, and the neighborhood got together and said,
yeah,
can't do that.
Can't do that.
You know, but again, if Paul's saying here, listen, if you're the best neighbor in the neighborhood, if you're obedient, now one of the places where I struggle with my HOA, and thankfully they don't have police cars and traffic tickets, you know, because they're busted me all the time because the speed limit's 15 and I'll drive 19 sometimes, you know.
19.
I mean, it's just, you know, I'm just one of those.
Because we're
kind
being
of guys,
honest
you know.
on the podcast. Okay.
I mean, you know, so true rebel without a cause, you know. But you know, it's just that kind of thing. And they get really upset. Oh, you know, we can't have all these cars speeding around here. Well, we're speeding. But anyway, but you want to be obedient. I want to be a good neighbor.
Yeah.
It's not because I want to drive 15, but I want to be a good neighbor. You know, I don't want to accidentally hit somebody's dog, you know, and go to jail for it. You know, I mean, I don't want to, and you know, I want to be courteous, and I want to be, even though sometimes I don't want to be, I want to, you know, we want to be courteous, we want to be, you know, we want to be kind, we don't want to be slanderers, we don't want to be talebearers, we don't want to be gossipers. That's not what you want coming out of your home.
Yeah.
Into, you know, this is the neighborhood going, this is the way the Stanlands are, they do these things. And Paul's just saying, don't walk into their misconception. Don't fill out their outline of you as the crazy person that drinks blood and eats flesh and then does these weird things. And then on top of that, you're a terrible person. You're a terrible neighbor. You're a bad person to live by. You know, I mean, I love the fact that my neighbors on both sides of me like me.
Yeah.
You know, one likes me better, but they like me,
Now
and
they're gonna wonder who they
we
are.
get along. We have conversations. We meet, and if they're, I've taken food. I mean, they've taken food to me. It's not, I want to be that person. I want to be a decent person. And some of this stuff is just Paul saying, just be nice.
Yeah.
Nice is not a biblical word. Be kind
Yeah.
to people.
Yeah.
Be obedient. Watch.
Courtesy.
Don't go outside. Don't see how close you can get to breaking the law without breaking it. Don't live on the edge. Don't be that person. Because the world has misconceptions of what you are already. If you do these things, you just validate their argument. Oh, well, yeah, you see, that's what they are.
So then let me ask you a question, and I guess you can chime in on this as well. I feel like the generations above me, perhaps, and maybe mine as well, seem to be more angry about how the culture has shifted in America. I'm just saying, so like what would you say to somebody? Because it's like, all right, so it says speak evil to no one, avoid quarreling, instead be gentle and show perfect courtesy. So what do you say, though, to the person who remembers the day when the culture was, we would say, better, holistically, leaned more towards the Christian values, however you want to say that, but now they've seen such the swing happen, and now there's even maybe a perceived hostility towards us.
My problem that I see with people in my age group is that we see that, but what we're in love with and what we are reminiscing about is the way the culture was in the 50s and 60s. I could leave my front door open. We had screen doors, and we'd leave our front doors open. We'd sit on the front porch and spend all night talking to our neighbors. Those were the days before air conditioning.
Yeah.
Yeah. You had to stay outside.
Yeah. Well, really. I mean, listen. No, I grew up in a house without air conditioning, and when I moved out, the year I moved out, my mom and dad got air conditioning. But anyway, but I mean, I was in that. It was just now coming out. It was just a big deal, and I remember sweltering. I mean, you didn't want to go in the house. It was awful. I mean, it's like walking into a warming up oven. It was just terrible to be inside. So we'd stay outside until it cooled down, and then you'd have your windows wide open, bugs and stuff inside. But I mean, you'd open it up because that's just what you did. But you kind of, you get into now this new day when you've got the two things that are shutting down community in our homes or our neighborhoods are air conditioning. And when we got air conditioning, we immediately saw a change in how people built their homes. People don't build homes with front porches anymore. You don't need one.
Yeah.
If you have a porch, it's usually a back porch because you can fence it in and lock it down. And so you got that, and you got garage door openers.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to get out of your car to say hi to a neighbor.
Yeah.
You
Pull
don't
in
have
your
to
trash.
just roll in, shut the door, don't talk
Yep.
to anybody. So I think there's some lament over losing that sense of community. We used to be together as a neighborhood. We used to be together as a community. We used to work together on things. We used to get together on projects. We used to help people that needed help. And
in a way, that was probably even profitable for the church because it naturally forced the Christians to intermingle with non-Christians.
It was easier to do outreach because you had a network. You had relationships. But the other, that's a whole different conversation.
But that's important though because now you got, and I feel this even in my community. I'm a brand new community, and I'm like I don't really know my neighbors because we all just go inside. No one plays out in the yard or anything like that, and so just having mechanisms like that to force us to be outside. To interact with each other would be almost beneficial to the gospel.
Pass a flyer around the neighborhood, say, let's everybody shut your air conditioner down.
Yeah.
Well, obviously that's
Turn
not
in
going to
your
work.
garage door opener, and we'll get back to the 50s.
And it's true. It's definitely within these generations a discussion to have. But it's a good reminder to us as Christians reading God's Word that. Again, this has been 2,000 years. There's been lots of different cultures and lots of different generations and lots of different changes. And so there's nothing new under the sun. It's a different argument.
But it's the same. But it's the same battle. The culture shifts, but we still have to. Again, let me go back to what I did do in the sermon. There are pathways and positions we need to take as we deal with relating to the culture. There's a posture that every church has, whether we mean to have it or not. It's the one that we take. And you hear it, it gets communicated from the pulpit, it gets communicated from, the church paper, the church groups, everything else that goes on with the church that communicates with itself. And it either tells you, love your culture, fear your culture, hate your culture, engage your culture, be like your culture. There's the messaging that's happening all the time. But I think, and I'm basing this a little bit off of an old book called Christ and Culture by a Christian a theological sociologist named Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote a book called Christ and Culture, or Christ and the Center. And he talks in that book about how the church relates. There's 4 different kind of points of relationship, and I bounced some of my thoughts off of his work, in the message, but he deals with the 4 postures being. His B.A. Carson rewrote his book, and I would say if you're going to read something. Neighbor's book is smaller, but it takes you longer to read than Carson's book. Carson's book is bigger, but it's a little bit more, Neighbor's book was coming out of World War II and how people were dealing with culture then. Mm-hmm. So this is an updated version of Reinhold Niebuhr's work that Carson did. It's really good. It's not a quick read, and it's not a shallow read.
Let's flash that up for the camera.
Yeah. So there's the book.
Watchers, viewers, and listeners.
Yeah. So
D.A. Carson, Christ and Culture Revisited.
Yeah, but again, it's a thoughtful book. It really helps you think through how are we supposed to do this. But you're either in the world and against the world, or you're in the world and then you are retreating from the world, or you are in the world and you are compromising with the world and integrating it into your practice and your the ideas and ideals of the world, or you're in the world and you're a transforming agent of the world. Mm-hmm. You are salt and light, and you are transforming the world. So what we want to shoot for is that 4th posture. We want to be in the world as a transformative presence. We don't want to be in the world. You cannot go through the funnel of this world and not touch the culture. You don't get to do that.
Right.
You just can't do that.
Right.
And that is the struggle with this whole positioning, is how do we live in a culture, no matter how your culture looks, whether it is you are in the culture where you are completely covered with tattoos and your hair's dyed and you have, you're in that particular culture, or you're in what we would call more comfortable culture for us, where we are in Fruit Cove. How do we live in the Fruit Cove's culture? How does Fruit Cove's culture affect you?
Yeah.
How does it affect how you think? It does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's not theological. It just affects you're in this culture, so you are imbibing of this culture in some way, shape, or form. It's affecting you. It's pulling you along, and some folks that are missionaries personally. It's interesting for them to walk into this culture.
Oh yeah. We were talking about that actually late into the night last night. They're hanging out with us, and it was interesting. He was saying, so the most interesting thing is that he has electricity, but everyone around him, for the most part, they still cook over open fire, because that's traditionally what they did. Right. But in order to get your fire going, you need something to start it with. Mm-hmm. And so what everybody does is they all have this little pot, and they just walk around like, hey, do you have any coals? Thanks. Mm-hmm. And then they'll just pass it over walls, over fences, through each other's windows. And it's like someone's got a coal. And it's and they said it's very typical for a child to be walking down the road with this little pot of coals so you can cook, so you can start your family meal. And so things like that, we don't see that in our culture anymore. I don't see a lot of cross blending and stuff like that. to me, so let's say Fruit Cove, that's why I do a lot with schools and campus ministries, because that seems to be the hub for our culture where everybody kind of has some sort of point of contact. And so, let's say we've got someone who's not from our church or at a different church, different community, I would be like, find those hubs, find those points of contact in your culture, and just kind of sit in that hub and just be there and be present and be active, because God's going to give you opportunities, to do stuff like that. So, but yeah, walking around with the coals and passing it through windows and stuff, I was like, that's pretty fun. Like, I was like, what do you do? He's like, I just go ask for coals. I was like, but you don't need coals. He's like, that's right. I don't need coals. I just go because I want to hang out.
It's a conversation starter.
Yeah.
It's a fire starter, but a conversation starter too. How do we do that? But so each of the positions, whether you are taking the position of being in the world or the culture, but opposing it. So you're always, John Dickerson, in I believe it was the Great Evangelical Recession, wrote that you as a church are either going to major on admonition or mission in the world. You're either going to admonish the world, you're going to be continually being critical of and speaking out against the culture in the world, or you're going to be on mission to see how you're going to try to reach the world. And of course, he's advocating the mission path versus, the admonition. But he said most churches, we lock ourselves up and then we just preach to people. We preach to people that aren't there.
Yeah.
We tell the people that are there how terrible the people that are not there are.
Wow.
We admonish the church. We admonish the world, but we do it through our church people. So we load them up with this negative, this anti-cultural perspective in an effort to say, don't let the culture pollute you. But the danger of that is that you are so separate from the culture that you can't touch the culture and infect it with salt and light. So there's a tension.
So you're saying verse 2 when it says to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling and be gentle, that's not just talking about just gossip and rumor amongst people that know each other. I think you mean we're supposed to not. Yeah, I watch our mouths when we talk.
I think. You can go all the way to the top and say, okay, what does that say about how we relate to our boss, our teacher, our spouse, our spiritual leaders, our government leaders? How do we? Are we known for speaking evil of people? And honestly, some churches are known for speaking. I mean, they are. They see that as their calling is. I'm going to tell people what is. These people are wrong.
I'm prophet.
And there's that kind of mentality that some people have that is really, really cancerous. It's a real negative thing. So it's that, but it's also, I kind of spun it a little bit more toward the internet because that's, I think more where those kind of things are carried today than just in conversation. I think people they shoot at each other.
Well, that was some research that came out of the whole 2020 pandemic, and I remember, was it like 2 or 3 episodes, we had someone say like, all right, what are some things that are different now than what they were?
Oh yeah.
And it's the word that was coined was inhibitionism. Where you because you're talking to the screen, you're typing to the screen instead of face to face. I'll roast you on Facebook, but I would never say that to your face about your kids or something like that.
I would never say something like that to your face.
But on social media, I will rip you to shreds, and so now we have this distrust of each other because you'll really say something that's very condescending, very sharp, biting online. So now we can't have face to face conversations. Because I don't trust you anymore, because I see you, not just, maybe it's never even directed at me, maybe it's always about somebody else. I'm like, well, if he'll roast that guy, he'll definitely eat me alive. And so now there's this further separation among affinity groups and stuff like that. And so that was, I can't remember who did that research, but I remember finding that just fascinating. And, that's where it's like, speak evil of no one. It means no one. It means like not just the people within the church, it's outside of the church. It's people that you don't even agree with, Just don't. If if you don't have anything nice to say.
I think people
say
people
it.
need to remember where does that come from, right? I mean, obviously, the feel like the need to roast someone or attack someone or again, you can have a view that I don't like the way that this boss, this teacher, this government leader, I don't agree with them. But this passage is saying how you speak to them and about them needs to be in a way that
Is
respectful,
respectful.
and honors Christ. And so, but where does that come from? I think in a lot of cases this comes back to the core of what we've all experienced, even growing up as children and teenagers. That if somebody does something to hurt you, then come back at them. And I mean, we need to teach. We need to teach our children. We need to teach our adults. Like, listen, the way you respond to someone is not, to attack them back, but it is to respond to them in love. And maybe you speak up in a respectful way and say, I respectfully disagree.
Yeah.
But, to just come at them, attacking them physically, verbally, is just not the way that God would want us to do that.
But I feel like in our culture, the option of respectfully disagreeing is not an option
what I
anymore.
said at the beginning.
Yeah, it's
hard.
like we went through courses on how to present a logical argument, as part of like our degrees in research and stuff like that. You don't have to do that anymore. All you have to do is just attack people better than everybody else, and then you win the argument.
Again, I think this is what we see a lot of times. We find ourselves trying to argue logically. Sometimes I see this online in conversations. Somebody's trying to argue logically with a person who has felt their way emotionally into their position.
Yeah.
When you have a position, and again, we are being taught how to hold contrary positions in our culture. We're being taught how to hold contradictory positions in our mind. That's a woman, but we're supposed to call the woman a he.
Or them.
And the problem is, your children are normalizing into that. That's just normal. Of course you do.
Yeah.
That's their preferred pronoun. They want to be known as a he, but it's a woman. Doesn't matter. You refer to the woman as a he. That's a contradiction. That's a logical contradiction.
Yeah, it's a logical fallacy. Yeah.
Your mind goes, what? Your mind knows better, but again, your emotions say, well, this is what we have to do now. Again, we go back to that word, to be nice.
Yeah.
This
So, and I don't know if we have time for it, but
I think
we
we're down to
really
the last
don't.
couple
But
minutes.
if you can just quickly respond to that comment. All right, so if that's, say, the logical fallacy, but how do you address it logically if you said they emotionally felt their way into that position?
Yeah.
How do you talk to that person?
Well, again, a part of that is you put a period at the end of that statement. You can't. They have felt their way into this. They feel this is the right thing. Well, I don't care. I was reading an economic article from an economics professor who was talking to a young lady about, in her position about believing that, America was built on slave labor and therefore we should, and so they were arguing that issue. They were talking about that issue. And he was, trying to walk her logically along a path that she was not buying. Because, well, I just feel like, and he kept saying, you keep saying you feel like this. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't matter. This is how I feel.
Yeah.
So, in other words, today, it doesn't matter what logic is. What matters is your heart is saying this. This is what your heart tells you. This is right. So, therefore, we become... there was a day that you would say, well, I don't really care how you feel.
Right.
This is what's right because this is what makes sense. This is logic,
It's
this
logical.
is common sense. But everything in us is now saying logic and common sense just don't work. They don't fly.
So I guess my question is then, and I'm sorry if I'm belaboring this, but okay, for that person who's deviated from the logical, or we'll just say the gospel, if this is, the accepted doctrine, and they've deviated emotionally, they've felt their way into that, can you walk them back to it logically, or do you have to walk them back emotionally?
Well, that's going to depend on the person and depend on you. and how you enter the conversation. But I do think you have to start where they are. You cannot expect them to start where you are. So to start where they are, you have to try to understand. Okay, I get how you're feeling, and I'm sure if I had a common experience with you, I would feel the same way that you do. But can't you see how? Is there? You almost have to wake up a mind and just say, don't you understand that what you're saying
doesn't make sense?
Doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, anymore, what makes sense is.
Or go at it from a different angle. Whatever the hot button topic is, find out some other heart issue. Like go to some other
like you
heart
said,
issue.
Economics.
Well, you don't want to
Yeah.
come. What you don't want to do is you don't want to come across as hard-hearted. And I don't really care how you feel. This is, I'm going to tell you. I'm
Right.
going to come down on you. I'm going to tell you what I think and what I believe, versus trying to go. Okay, I want to try to feel what you're feeling. I want to understand how you got here. But you kind of got to go back into the cave with them a little bit and then walk them out. You can't just go, hey, come out here in the light and let's have a conversation. No, I'm going to stay here in the cave with my feelings.
But that's so good for Christians to understand. You got to go into the cave with them.
Yeah.
They're not going to come out to
Right,
you,
right.
and I think that's important.
Good. That's a good place to stop. Let's go there. Let's go ahead and end there. That makes sense to me to stop there. So, anyway, we're glad you were along. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Have any thoughts? We'd love to hear from you. So please email us at, what are we emailing now?
Dan@fruitcove.com.
Dan at fruitcove.com. He'll be glad to get your emails. But thanks for joining us today.